our first Best Ball Mania 4 co-managed draft of the season. That's what we're doing today on RotoViz Overtime, a bonus episode of the show. Myself, Colm Kelly, along with Shawn Siegele. We're going to be drafting, as we've just found out, from the 102. So I'm excited to see how we go here. The tricky part when we do these drafts, Shawn, is when we have a pick at the turn. It's okay on this 102, but on the other picks, then it's pretty rapid fire when you're also trying to do the podcast with the 30-second clock. But we will try our best to manage it, and hopefully people will enjoy along the way. If you are playing over at underdogfantasy.com, you can use the promo code RotoViz to get yourself a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100 while playing over there. Shawn, the 102, we did joke last year at one point that, I mentioned this, that I was happier getting some of these later draft picks because I was having so many 101s, 102s, 103s. Feels like we may be off to the same start here. It's either got to be Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase. I feel, though, they are the only two options here. And we'll just see whichever is left for us. Is that how you're thinking?
Well, you're not going to give Christian McCaffrey even a consideration, it sounds like.
I think the listeners of the podcast know that that's probably correct. Nothing against Christian McCaffrey, but we have to start off here, Shawn, with some wide receivers on our first BBM draft of the year.
I think so, especially from the 102. And as you mentioned, it's very nice to get this early pick. Colm, you're not going to make any friends by saying that you're getting too many 101s and 102s.
I thought you were saying I wasn't going to make any friends by drafting running backs at the start of drafts, and that's why I've been drafting wide receivers all this time. But in all fairness, Christian McCaffrey, I do think the next part of this is when it gets to the 103. Shawn, the drafter, has taken Tyreek Hill, but I do think Christian McCaffrey for me is probably that 103. Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp go next, McCaffrey at the 105, which I think is exceptional value there, followed by Travis Kelce. How do you feel about post those two guys who I mentioned that are, for me, the clear top options? Are you going into Christian McCaffrey then at 103, or are you still taking those other two wide receivers over him?
Well, I have my Underdog rankings pulled up, and it'll be a great exercise here in working through whether or not those rankings really work. One of the things that you want to do as you put your rankings together is find out if you're comfortable actually making the selections that fit there. Because one of the things that, as much as you fight it, you have the pull of the entire community, you have that risk aversion where you don't want to be wrong. Now, Colm, we do receive messages somewhat frequently saying that my rankings are often pretty out there, and maybe the listeners don't get the impression that I'm worried about being wrong on them, which what I would say is that, you're going to be wrong at different points, and you can't let that fear move you off of the right players and make you so conservative that your rankings aren't meaningful, aren't helpful. But none of us like to be wrong. And so from a human perspective, all of those things come into play. But what we really want to find out is when you're on the clock and when you're trying to win the $3 million. So again, Colm, $3 million to first place here. Whatever the rankings are, you better be comfortable drafting off of those. And that was sort of a long-winded way to say I have Cooper Kupp number 3, and then Christian McCaffrey 4, Bijan 5, Jonathan Taylor 6. So actually do have a little bit of running back inflation ahead of some of the other names there. I'm not quite as comfortable with the Hill, Diggs, Devontae Adams group of receivers in the middle of round 1 as ADP indicates. That's not to say that they're not fantastic players. They won't be good picks. But, even though you know that you have to be very wide receiver heavy early in these drafts, I don't know that we're getting quite the scoring level that it seems like you should when you're talking about players that early. One of the guys that we really do like that I have ranked above ADP, Jalen Waddle. He's someone where if he ends up outscoring Tyreek Hill this season, that wouldn't be remotely surprising. He's going to be a better value in drafts than Hill. Unless Hill hits his very top outcome or close to the top and Waddle hits an outcome that really is pretty surprising.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting, and that's always, if you're drafting, Shawn's rankings are available up on rotoviz.com. You can check them out. If you're drafting at the FFPC, you're able to check those out as well while drafting. huge advantage being able to have those. We are one pick away. T. Higgins goes at the 207. That's one pick ahead of, well, we're on the clock now. Shawn will run down the picks that are available after. Devontae Smith, Chris Olave are two of the prime options here for me. Feels like a spot where Olave is usually going in the mid-second round. I think it's a pick of Olave. I'm good with both, but we'll go based on your rankings today, I think.
And I do have Olave in the middle of the second round. I still have Breece Hall very early. And so he's somebody else that I would consider at that point. The news on the injury seems relatively positive. If he's healthy, I mean, he's going to absolutely crush. I think he would be the RB1. And so if you're even having to take a little bit of a slow start, it's still very appealing.
And you mentioned based on where you have him, he has an ADP of 28.8, so 29 basically. He is in your rankings as your RB6. He's going as the RB10, so there is an opportunity to get those. The goal here, Shawn, we take Olave, Devontae Smith or Breece Hall, hoping one of those gets back to us. Tony Pollard goes off the board, so we're guaranteed to get one of those two back. It's going to be an interesting decision here to see which one we take if both of them come back to us. But both very good options to try and pair along with Chase and also with Olave. So let's see. Devontae Smith goes off the board, Shawn. You also have Travis Etienne in the queue. Is there a decision to be made here, or is it clearly Breece Hall?
I think it's got to be clearly Hall. The top three players by ADP, Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Hall. I think those other running backs are fine selections as well, but for me, it's got to be Hall.
So we take Breece Hall. That lines up one running back. That is a third round running back, but we do get a nice start here, I think, with Chase, Olave, and then Breece Hall paired into it. Would your decision have been, and I feel it may have been, would you have went with Hall over Smith if that was the availability at that point?
Well, I think especially early on here in the BBM4 season, you want to get enough drafts under your belt where you have a lot of early wide receivers and you get a feel for how to build out the receivers early before you start feathering in too many of those early running backs. So I think that there's a pretty strong argument just structurally that if you are getting a good price on Devontae Smith, which it would have been if he had gotten one more spot to us, that you want to go ahead and take that. Then you have the three early wide receivers. You don't have to be as concerned about the wide receiver avalanche wiping you out. You pull up the RotoViz Underdog roster construction explorer, and you're going to see that wide receiver ×4 to start these drafts has been extremely successful. One of the reasons for that, obviously, because you have to have the three receivers, only the one flex in Underdog roster requirements, how that starting lineup is put together. And now especially the ADP has become more wide receiver heavy. You sort of have both dynamics now with the receivers where they have the scoring punch that's mitigated a little bit in half PPR, but that's balanced out again by what the format actually is with the two running back, three receiver, one flex. But then all of those dynamics where later running backs can emerge and be league winners, those things still exist, but it's harder to get your receiver depth. So the argument that was always made about taking some running backs early and getting back to receiver was that wide receiver is deep. That was never really the case, but it's now so clearly not the case that drafters are loading up on receiver, and you can be completely wiped out if you don't have some aggressiveness there. So from that perspective, I think you want to get very comfortable with how these drafts are going to go before you start pivoting to running backs, even running backs that you like and you think will be values once you get everything put together. You want to be very careful about that in the early going.
Yeah, and I think the other part of that is now with people adopting a more wide receiver heavy approach early. Obviously, that has been the case over the last couple of years, but more so even this year. I think we're going to start to see, and we are seeing, less running backs going in those opening 4 rounds, which is going to push some of those guys down as well. So also the other part is going to be interesting to watch the development of the running back dead zone, for example, and how things play out based on how people are drafting in this specific format for the half-point PPR. We will be drafting, Shawn, in 2 selections. Jerry Jeudy's there, Kenneth Walker's there, TJ Hawkinson, Keenan Allen, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. So we're going to have multiple options here. Allen is somebody who we've talked about in the podcast a number of times, has been extremely undervalued at the moment based on ADP, but he does go at the 409. That is the 45th pick. Then Kenneth Walker goes. Shawn, it's set up here to be the one and only Jerry Jeudy, I think.
I think that it is too. There are some concerns. You still have the Russell Wilson situation. You have Marvin Mims as a priority pick for them. That makes so much sense. And we think that he's going to be an instant impact guy. I think that that's going to have a bigger impact on Cortland Sutton, potentially on Tim Patrick. I don't think that they're going to have quite the emphasis on the tight ends, although we know that someone like a Jimmy Graham has had huge fantasy seasons under Sean Payton. But Jerry Jeudy, this is the breakout year.
So we're set on Jerry Jeudy. That leaves us waiting here, and I'm hoping that we get one more spot. That means TJ Hawkinson will come to us. There's one more selection to be before our next pick. DeAndre Hopkins went. Then, obviously, we're at the turn, so we're waiting on the 101 drafter to take their selection. Jackson Smith and Jigba, who I mentioned, is in the queue as well as an option. Chris Godwin. So Justin Herbert goes off the board. Shawn, I would be leaning to Hawkinson here at tight end. Are you leaning into tight end at this particular point? This is the 502. Or are you looking to continue now because we did take a running back to add in Smith and Jigba at this point?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, he's going to be the guy. He's going to score a lot of points. You're going to wish you had him on your roster, especially late in the best ball season. I think that he will be one of those players who is a tournament winner. So
are you talking here about JSN or Hawkinson?
I am. I'm talking about JSN.
Yeah, I thought that's who you were. What people might be wondering, what is he talking about?
Right. I think with the rookie at this point, you do want to, and it depends on how many drafts you're doing, obviously, but he's going to be such a good option when you have picks in the middle of the round, when you don't have some of the flexibility that we have when you have the 102. And so I think he makes a little bit more sense there. You don't want to get going so enthusiastically again, especially with a rookie that your exposure ends up being really high. With Hawkinson being a little bit of a faller right there, and it is about a half round early for JSN, I think that moves us back in the direction of Hawkinson. And Colm, I know that he has been one of, if not a clear-cut starter in the all-time OT lineups. He was one of the guys who really drove that Superflex FFPC team to the finals last season. We got a little bit lucky with that in that the trade to Minnesota just was a huge catalyst for his emergence as a star. They have selected Jordan Addison. They still have Kirk Cousins. Are you on board with the idea that he's going to be able to continue to do what he did in the second half of last season?
It mightn't be a case where he does to the extent and to the concentration of points, targets, receptions, and so on, but I think that he's going to be a top 5 tight end this year. We take him at tight end 4 in this draft. I think that looking at where that offense is going, we all have our questions around Kirk Cousins, but you're in a situation where he came in and things worked out as smoothly as they did, as quickly as they did. You look at things like another off season and the offense to get acclimatized. Always like teams that play in domes, there's a little bit of the advantage there. And I just think that when we look around this offense as a whole, in terms of, we're talking about JSN and you're looking at how does that concentration of targets work with Lockett still there, with DK Metcalf there, with Geno Smith, as much as we love him as the quarterback. And we're in a situation then when we're looking at Minnesota where the 2 clear stars in terms of the pass catching options are Hawkinson and is Justin Jefferson. So I'm pretty confident that we're going to see maybe not a 16 or 17 game sample of what we've seen since the trade, but we're going to see a pretty strong season where we're not going to be wondering where Hawkinson has gone. That was the start of the breakout. The breakout is going to continue here.
Love to hear you say that. With that being the case, it does look like one of Kyle Pitts or Dallas Goedert will make it to our next pick. That obviously an interesting contrast there in terms of would we have preferred to have JSN and now Goddard versus taking Hawkinson and looking at guys like Mike Evans, DeAndre Swift, George Pickens, Jordan Addison at the top of the list here. Colm, what are you thinking here? We got 10 seconds.
I think, well, you can overrule me on the Mike Evans pick if you want. I think I would go George Pickens here. I didn't know if you were going to overrule. We didn't have much time left. It was almost like Shawn asked me the question. I was waiting to see if he decided just to pick whoever he wanted. I'm interested now to see if he would have went with Evans. There's a chance Evans comes back to us. You mentioned about the tight end situation. Pitts did go one pick before. I would have potentially been interested in doubling up on tight end if Pitts had made it through, like Goddard as well, but just not as much as I still like Pitts, particularly his value. Pitts in this draft goes at the 6'10", Goddard goes at the 6'12", then we get Cam Akers. So we're in a situation, Shawn, now here where we do have an option to potentially, if you wanted Evans at that last pick, to take him again. DeAndre Swift is there as an option, Jahan Dodson, Jordan Addison, Quentin Johnson. I would be between Dodson, I think, and Evans here. But have you a lean towards Swift, or where do you want to go? Now, Shawn takes Mike Evans. The question comes back. Shawn, when we were on the clock at the 6:11, did you want to take Mike Evans or George Pickens?
Well, if I'm doing it solo, then I probably take Evans and then Swift. But I love George Pickens. I think there is the chance for the breakout. Deontay Johnson was one of the most disappointing players in the entire league last year. I think that he gets it going again in 2023, but once you're coming off of a down season, there's not a guarantee that you get it back. And the frustrating part with Pickens was that with all the highlight plays that he put together, the issue was one of really commanding targets. Now, I mean, his situation going back to college with the injuries that he had makes it a little more complicated there, because we're still anticipating that this is the guy who may end up being the biggest talent from that draft class last year. He had to play with, sort of a poor quarterback to start with in Mitchell Trubisky, and then you get a rookie quarterback who's trying to kind of learn his way. And a breakout with Pickett and Pickens together is one of the potential plays that could lead a lot of your teams to fantasy titles in 2023. So you want to have exposure to that. It's also a situation here where drafting Pickens gives us the chance to go with Kenny Pickett later to get that pairing at QB. Right now, Colm, we have a number of potential later round quarterbacks who would accomplish that. We have Olave, we have Judy, we have Pickens, we have Evans. The quarterbacks from those four players are not going to be expensive. And that's helpful for us in this particular draft because we didn't select a QB early. One of the potential picks that got close to us but didn't come back was Joe Burrow. If he had come back in that fourth round when we already have Jamar Chase and we know how expensive the star QBs are this season, would that have been just a very easy clear-cut pick?
Yeah, he just went off the board just before, so Shawn sharing the draft board now to look through it, and I think that would have been a tough one to pass up if he did make it back. We go Jerry Jeudy at that point. He goes at the 43rd pick. We picked at the 47. We never really got into that discussion ahead of the pick, but yeah, he would have been interesting. Then you're looking at Justin Herbert, then Trevor Lawrence, then Deshaun Watson based on the next two rounds. There's only three quarterbacks going there. So there is that split. Once you get to Herbert, there's the gap then kind of down below that. So we'll see. And Shawn, as the listeners know, we like to get our elite quarterbacks. There's no doubt about that. But in some of these drafts, we like to take our shots on those later options as well. So we have some potential options to pair in. I'm pretty happy with how this has played out so far. We took Breece Hall when you were talking about loading up on the wide receiver position and the benefits of that. But I think, outside of what we have done with the the 5 wide receivers, we have got our tight end and we've also got Breece Hall. I think we're setting up here pretty nicely to give us a lot of flexibility as we move on throughout this draft. We're 7 selections away. Shawn, I mentioned that I would have potentially leaned Jahan Dodson when we were at that last selection. He is still available. Let's see if he sneaks his way back. We have Quentin Johnson as well available. We are in a range here potentially where some of the quarterbacks will be quite interesting too. So we'll see how it plays out. We are still 6 selections away before we are up. How are you feeling about these next couple of rounds and where this team may start to, develop in a different direction?
I don't think it's going to get to us, but certainly Dotson and Johnston would be slam dunk picks here. We have 5 wide receivers. We know that right about 8 is the sweet spot in Underdog. You want to get there early, but you don't want to overdraft the receivers. Then you don't want to have so much exposure that you're not getting the full running back depth that you need. I added a lot of running backs to the queue recently in Javonte Williams, James Cook, Brian Robinson, Devin Achane, Rashad Penny, Samaje Perine, Kendra Miller. And then a little bit later, you've got guys like Jarrett McKinnon and Roschon Johnson. So there are a lot of guys to pick from there. One of the things to always keep in mind is just because there are a lot of guys, they'll go kind of in a group. So you're not going to be able to add all of those players, obviously, to your team. Colm, we did see those 2 wide receivers go off the board right before us there. Johnson was the 807, Dotson 808. We are now on the board at the 811. The other thing that happened was that Tua went 2 picks ahead of us. So I don't know that this is a particularly clear spot to pick in. I do like either Javonte Williams or James Cook, who are the 2 top guys by ADP.
Yeah, they're the 2 options I think we should go for here. And I'm good with which way you want to go. I'll let you lead it since we're basing it on the rankings here. So we do go for James Cook. I think the tiebreaker still falls towards Cook there purely around Williamson and his recovery from injury. Is that still a concern for you? And I guess it's a concern for everyone because he wouldn't be going as a running back 28 if that wasn't a concern.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge, right? So I have Cook at the running back 19. I think it's a fantastic value for him. Williams as running back 21. I'm very comfortable taking them both, but you have to go into the Williams pick with eyes wide open. Samaje Perine, somebody who is available a little bit later, and also seems like he's going to be a huge scorer. Colm, this is a fun early draft. We've got Breece Hall. If Javonte Williams is healthy in the second half of the year, I mean, you're talking about a guy who would be a consideration clearly in the mid-second round, if not at the 1-2 turn. We add him in, and we're trying to win the $3 million. We're not going to
we're
get cold feet or
we're
lack
rooting
the
for those
courage
knees
to
to be 100%. Everyone's knees heal here over the next couple of months. But if we hadn't went with Williams there, we've gone running back to get Cook and Williams in those 2 selections, and I'm pretty happy to pair them there with Breece Hall as we had. I think Bateman is probably the selection there if we don't go that way. The quarterback range, I'm trying to wait in some of these guys' quarterbacks by ADP that we have in the queue. Or Aaron Rodgers would technically be going around this zone. Then you have Jared Goff, Derek Carr, Kenny Pickett, but they are all going kind of around, Jared Goff's around after Rodgers, Carr's 2 rounds after that, and then Pickett as well after that. So in this particular draft that we were in, it feels like they are the correct selections. But if we hadn't have gone running back there, Shawn, would it be a case, really for me, the only wide receiver that really was standing out there was Bateman. Obviously, Jameson Williams goes a couple of picks after him. So the picks since have been Bateman, AJ Dillon, Jameson Williams, but Williams is going to be missing those 6 games to start the season.
Yeah, it's so tough to take him when they've raised questions about his practice habits and when you have the suspension. I wouldn't be surprised. And we just picked a player who may miss the first 6 weeks with injury, and then once he is back, still not be 100%. So
yeah,
it's hard to criticize a player who, I mean, you're expecting him to actually play, and he's not going to get hurt in the first 6 weeks when he's on suspension. Now you say that, and obviously it's possible to get hurt or to get resuspended or fall afoul of the NFL in a variety of ways.
Well, let's hope he doesn't get resuspended. That would be terrible. Jameson, if you're listening, do not get resuspended, please.
Yeah, it would be great if you used your devices in the correct locations. Colm, the kind of tension that we have in this draft is that we are loaded everywhere except for quarterback. But quarterback counts. And elite quarterbacks have really driven a lot of these teams over the last several years. You have a guy like Kyler Murray, where again,
He just went. I was just about to say.
Yeah, where you don't know exactly when his contribution is going to come. But I like it because, as we mentioned before, you have Olave, you have Judy, you have Pickens, and those quarterbacks are still available.
Yeah, and as you said, Kyler Murray, he did go off the board at the 10:06, and I still feel like, I know there's the injury concern heading into the season. There's been concerns about play over the last couple of years at times, but I have to say Kyler Murray feels like he's still been severely undervalued. When we look at our options, so we are back on the clock. Jared Goff is there. It's right at ADP for Goff. There isn't a clear option for me unless we want to go Brian Robinson here at running back, or Samaje Perine. We obviously have already gone the opposite direction. I'm good here, Shawn, with Goff, if that's the way we want to go, and then reevaluate at the next selection here in 4 picks time. But Shawn has gone with Brian Robinson, which I'm also happy with here.
Well, Robinson was one of the guys that I mentioned as a post-draft winner at the running back position. I think that he is positioned very nicely for the 2023 season. Colm, as I say that, we do need to make another pick here. And I mean, I was going to make a pitch for Kendre Miller, but he actually goes in between the two selections. I kind of want to wait at quarterback because...
Let's go P. Is Perine the way you want to go? Yeah, let's do it. Are we going to get it? We got it, Shawn. That I think you clicked. If we end up winning this, I think you clicked draft. There must be, in the NFL where the ref is, or the official is meant to, look at the play clock, then look at the ball, then look back up. You get that little bit of a extra beat at 0:00 on the clock, and it's like, Shawn, I might check the video footage of this to see if we got in on time, but we get Perine. I don't know. Shawn was going to let it go to Goff. I'll be honest and hold my hands up here. We don't have any players from the Detroit Lions, Shawn, on this roster. And my brain, as we start to do this draft, we're doing it live, I can't separate Jared Goff from TJ Hawkinson in my mind. So we have Hawkinson on this roster, and we have no need. I'm glad we bypassed Goff on those two selections. That was maybe an error on my part. We'll see if he gets back, though, potentially in the next round. I think he's going to be gone well past ADP. But I feel in this draft, and I don't know how you're feeling about it at this point, but I'm good if we can get Kenny Pickett and Russell Wilson to pair along with Sam Howell here as our dream quarterback room. How are you feeling about that if we can pull it off?
Did you just say Kenny Pickett and Russell Wilson as our dream quarterback room?
With Sam Howell.
The
three-headed monster.
The three-headed monster. One of the things that we do know about these underdog drafts is that the two quarterback approach, and we've written about two quarterbacks in the window for a long, long time, that tends to be the way to win. Now, the other element of it in the last several years is that even above the window, that elite QB with another QB and potentially waiting a little bit on the second quarterback can be a very dynamic attack as well. You're not really looking to do the three quarterback, but we want to remain mentally flexible. So if there's an element where we're probably going to need that third quarterback in order to have the overall roster firepower, and if it's the case where we have a QB that we have ranked enough higher that it's sort of a no-brainer anyway, then we're not going to let the fact that there are some differences and clear differences and differences stretching over multiple years in terms of win rate, advance rate, that type of thing. We're not going to be so inflexible that we pass up a player who makes a lot of sense for this particular roster. So as you mentioned, this could be a Pickett, Wilson, either Ritter or Howell draft. I've put Jordan Love in the queue as well. We had some interesting reports this past week that people covering the team think that Romeo Doubs could be the main guy in the passing game, at least from the perspective of leading with receptions. Now, if you watched last year's preseason where Jordan Love played extensively, then he and Romeo Doubs had a great connection. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I expect Christian Watson to be the guy. He was just so good last season. But with the pick and with some of the enthusiasm surrounding Jaden Reed, I would still recommend that people keep an eye on Romeo Doubs. He's someone who could be undervalued. We expect to score a lot of points this next season. Colm, we are now into the range here where we could see the quarterbacks go. Sadly, Russell Wilson goes right before it, and then Doubs was the pick right ahead of us. I was going to select a Doubs and then come back with Jordan Love at the 1302. Where would you like to go here?
I think we go with Pickett. Are you happy to take Kenny Pickett here?
Yeah.
I had a question then to add into that on Kenny Pickett in terms of where he is going at Underdog at the moment, ranked as the quarterback 25. You have him as the quarterback 19 in your rankings, but that is a mid-round 10 grade that you have him in. We get him at the 12, 11. Is that just a case that you think that there's a big gap in an ADP between the guys going ahead of him? Is there players in there that you're not that interested in? I think that I'm very aligned with you. And
the picks in between Alec Pierce and Chase Brown, we know that Chase Brown is a huge riser, one of the trendiest players in fantasy. We like him. Colm, this is a great spot for Love, even without having Romeo Doubs.
Yeah, let's do it. I would have been interested as well in potentially going with Schultz or Dulcich there as the second tight end, but I think based on how we've gone a quarterback, I think that makes sense to add it in. Disappointing to not be able to pair it up, as you mentioned, with Doubs, but it would have been tricky there. We could only have taken 2 out of those 3 players, and with how the roster has developed so far, probably having the 2 quarterbacks makes sense. Pickett again. Do you feel like you're higher on Pickett than most people, or do you feel that the market's just not right at the moment?
Well, I think you have to have a ranking that reflects his chance to break out. And anyone who has followed Blair Andrews' research, and I mean, this is also intuitive in its own way, but the numbers are there as well, that for first round quarterback picks, year 2 is the breakout. It's easy to look at some of the hiccups in year 1. You even think back to Trevor Lawrence, who's an uber prospect, and how he struggled. The value that you got on him in last year's drafts, pretty significant. I like the weapons that are around Pickett. So when you are in a situation where you have a Deontay Johnson, you have a George Pickens, you have a Pat Freiermuth, I mean, we don't necessarily believe in him, but you can even add in depth of Allen Robinson. You can add in Darnell Washington, a fantastic value that they just got in the rookie draft.
And out of those quarterbacks that haven't broken out, if you don't include Love, who hasn't played yet, he definitely has the best, talent around him in terms of offensive players.
Yeah, you look at the weapons for CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson. I mean, it's pretty excruciating, right? It's bleak. And so from that perspective, you want to bet on the guy. And you can look back historically too, at which quarterbacks do break out. And there's this strong connection to players who are surrounded by better weapons. You can even think back to last season where we see Tua break out once they add in Tyreek Hill. I want the QB where you have the weapons. Obviously, we already had George Pickens. And that's sort of another little thing. We have a question about this that we're going to address sort of in a full show or part of a full show, kind of going into rankings and going into Underdog. But the ranking on Pickett as well reflects the fact that he is a nice player to put with Freiermuth, to put with Deontay Johnson, to put with George Pickens. And all of those guys are priced in a range where you can do both of those things without having to really extend yourself and break down other parts of your build. So I think it's really hard not to like him a little ahead of where he's being priced.
Yeah, and with Shawn's rankings, based on where he went in this, we take him at the back of the 12th round, but 3 picks away from our next selection. We will then do a roster rundown as we close out towards the end of the draft to see where we need to add those spots. We currently have 2 quarterbacks, 5 running backs, 5 wide receivers, 1 tight end. It's going to be interesting. I was hoping, Shawn, some of these tight ends would have slid back. I mentioned Greg Dulcich. The last round, he goes 4 picks ahead of us. Then Sam Laporta went in that next selection. So we'll see what potentially could come back to us. We talked on our show earlier this week about Michael Mayer versus the rookie tight ends and how things would play out there. He is somebody who is still available here as a potential option. quite a few wide receiver options, Shawn, going in this range as well. Who are you targeting? Who are you hoping is that player that lasts one more selection here?
Well, Rondale Moore is somebody I've had ranked a lot higher. There's such a big gap between my rankings and ADP that I have to make sure I look at that and make sure that that isn't mostly a mistake on my part. He's obviously less enticing as well now that we get the impression that DeAndre Hopkins will be back. I think that this looks like either Wan'Dale Robinson or Michael Mayer.
Which way do you want to lean? Who do you think may get back to us and who do you think won't? So let's make the ADP call on that in terms of highest ADP here, which is Wendell.
So we'll go with Wan'Dale. He's somebody who probably undervalued because they added a lot of pieces that are vaguely similar, obviously coming off of the injury, but the way he looked in his limited run last year after they made a very clear bet on him in the draft. He's going to be ahead of some of these other guys. When you talk about Hyatt in terms of trajectory, he's going to be more talented than some of the other underneath pieces. So I like that selection. Mayer does come back to us, as you mentioned, so we'll go with him on this pick. And Colm, this is kind of back to the position now to discuss a topic that was on our minds early, which was how do you get enough wide receivers? Because once you hit, it's not even really a dead zone. It's this vast desert at the receiver position once the key guys are gone. So we had the 5 receivers early, but then not another one. We're just up to 6 right now. We have 3 selections left. We know that 2 of those need to be wide receivers. There are going to be some interesting running backs who are still left. We're discussing taking Sam Howell because, frankly, if you won a tournament with Kenny Pickett and Jordan Love as your QBs, you would be surprised, right? So
the other
we still
note
have
on
a
that
lot
is,
that we want to do and 3 picks left.
The other part of that is on the wide receiver point that you made, there is almost 100 picks in terms of when we picked our 5th and when we picked our 6th. So you mentioned that chasm. There's quite a big space there, and that gives you the option then to, ideally we would have some more higher end elite quarterbacks to pair with these, maybe one, and then these 2 guys are Kenny Pickett and one earlier. But the way things played out, this has obviously felt like the right call throughout this draft. We'll see how it plays out at the end of the draft and how it plays out come Best Ball Mania 4 final time. But Shawn, to give a run through the entire roster, we have Kenny Pickett, we have Jordan Love, Breece Hall, James Cook, Javonte Williams, Brian Robinson, Samaje Perine. Then as we move into the wide receivers, it's Jamar Chase, Chris Olave, Jerry Jeudy, George Pickens, Mike Evans, Wendell Robinson. And then that gives us Hawkinson and Mayer as our tight ends. One question, Shawn, people might just be asking, sometimes we'll touch on having a handcuff option, I guess we'll say, in a running back room, for example, like we have here with Williams and Perine. In this situation, for me, it's a little bit different because you also have the baked-in concerns about the recovery in those early weeks. You mentioned the possibility that Williams might miss the opening couple of weeks of the season. Is that one where you're willing to make that choice, or is it a case that we know we've talked about Perine in the past and we've talked about Williams as a case you just like the talent of both guys? How are you playing into that as having the 2 running backs on the same roster?
Yeah, you still wouldn't want to have a handcuff situation if you have really any other good options to play it. But I don't look at this really as a handcuff situation so much as both of these guys individually should score a lot of points. When we talk about backfields that have this dynamic, we look a little bit at your Packers backfield with Aaron Jones and then either Jamal Williams or A.J. Dillon behind him. But the most obvious example would be all of those Saints backfields with Alvin Kamara and then Mark Andrews and then Mark Ingram, or a variety of other backs there. Russell Wilson doesn't throw to the running backs in the same way. We'll see if Sean Payton really schemes it to force him to do that. But Payton has been such a source of fantasy points to the running back, and both of these guys potential stars. I think they can score meaningful points that would have them undervalued at the prices that we paid if they're together. And then obviously if you do get one of them hurt, the other guy is a league winner who you'd really want to have up there in round 3. So yeah, it's not a handcuff situation. It's a bet on talent, and it's a bet that this running back group is going to score a ton of points.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to say is the price makes it affordable rather than, taking a Breece Hall and then trying to get an Abanikanda later. I think this works out in a much better way. So Thornton goes off the board, Reed goes off the board. Shawn, we are in a situation where Reed would have been nice to go with Love. We're on the clock. Seconds are ticking down. How are you feeling here about rounding this out? That would have been my pick, would have been Reed, but I'm going to leave this one up to you as we sit here.
Yeah, so it doesn't exactly fit, but we're going to go ahead and take Chuba. He's easily the best player available. And then looking specifically at the wide receivers down the stretch, do you have a guy that you like? I mean, Hodgins, somebody who does project to factor in there. I mean, I'm tempted to take a Richie James with the Kansas City Chiefs. We don't even necessarily know that he'll make the roster. I'm
good going with Trey McBride if you want to go tight end.
Okay. So we're going to end up here with a build that is not precisely ideal, but we are going to lean into taking the best player. So I think that when we do the recap, we're looking at TJ Hawkinson, even with a good price there. In retrospect, you want a wide receiver instead. Again, I think that same thing is true with Mayer because you're going to get McBride at this price. We passed on Rondale hoping to get the fantastic price. That didn't turn out. He goes a little bit ahead of our pick. Colin, the thing that was really heartbreaking is that right before we selected, we lose Tyquan Thornton. And he was the guy that I think is such a clear-cut pick. The handful of picks kind of running up to us. And again, in round 16, it falls off a cliff. So you have to be aware of this. I'm not saying that we necessarily thought these guys would make it or they should have made it. But Rondale Moore, Marvin Mims, Mechie, Shakir, I think, is a little bit more of a thinner path, but somebody we do like. And then Thornton and Jaden Reed. Reed would have been someone interesting because we have Jordan Love. It's unfortunate to get Love at a great price and yet not have someone paired up with him there. So that's what happened in round 16 at the receiver position. It is one of the reasons why if you have a pick in the middle of the rounds, you're in a little bit better position to get the falling values and not have to reach McCollum. Obviously, we can't complain about being able to get Jamar Chase at the beginning. As we head into round 18, we're going to have to take a deep wide receiver option at this point.
Yeah, we'll see the goal here. It's not going to happen, Shawn. The hope would be that we see Hodgins make it back to us. But I'm not overly confident on that being the case. We did get kind of I had a couple of options that I really was hoping to come back to us there, and they all kind of got wiped out pick by pick by pick. So we also lost out on Sam Howell just before that. Then, as you mentioned, we get Thornton that goes off the board. Then we get Reed, who would have made sense for this build. I was at a real flat zone there in terms of the players available. We go with tight end, which, as you mentioned, isn't the most ideal scenario for these builds. Was there somebody else who was in the mix there for you that you would have taken over the tight end?
No. No. The receiver position is definitely barren at this point. But to mention a few of the guys who are still available and are interesting in, one way, shape, or form. You have Justin Ross, another off-season puff piece hero. It's hard to resist that, but it does feel like burning a pick to no value. We have Jerry Jeudy on this particular team. You can add in a Tim Patrick, who, because he didn't play last season, is probably getting pushed down farther than he deserves. At the same time, he can be farther than he deserves and still not be a good pick for the types of rosters that we like to build. Cedric Tillman, an interesting selection there with the Cleveland Browns. We're not really on him as a prospect, but the Browns, still a team I think that needs a lot at receiver. I mean, Elijah Moore could come in there and do some serious damage. So we'll have to track what he does, but that part a little bit tricky. And then Joshua Palmer. He's someone who can get forgotten because of the really strong selection of Quentin Johnston, but a player in that particular offense where those starters in Keenan Allen and Mike Williams have really struggled to stay healthy. Palmer, one of these guys who has been both trendy and then also sort of a punching bag at this point. Colm, I kind of like him as the pick here. I wouldn't be surprised if he comes through in an injured situation.
Yeah, let's go for it. It's always concerning when we click on the player and the news, the most recent news is that he's sliding down the depth chart, but you can always climb back up.
Sliding down the depth chart. Quentin Johnson in there, he's going to be the guy.
You can always climb back up the depth chart again, as you mentioned, maybe through injury. The other players that are there, Cedric Tillman, Tim Patrick, it would be brilliant to see Tim Patrick come back healthy and be, a big part of that offense, but it is pretty crowded there at the particular moment. Tillman or Ross, I think maybe going with the upside is another way to play it, but let's run through the team, Shawn, and see how we feel as the dust has settled here. The opening 10 rounds, I think I was at probably the high point, and it probably tailed off a little bit after that, but I'm still quite excited about this roster and what we'll be able to take from it and learn from it. So we get Jamar Chase, Chris Olave, Breece Hall, Jerry Jeudy, TJ Hawkinson, George Pickens, Mike Evans, James Cook, Javonte Williams, Brian Robinson, Samaje Perine, Kenny Pickett, Jordan Love, Wendell Robinson, Michael Mayer, Chuba Hubbard, Trey McBride, and then we rounded out with Josh Palmer. So there's a couple of selections here, Shawn, when we look at it, that I think you mentioned the pivot point of TJ Hawkinson. And looking back as to how the draft played out, I do think that was somewhere where, in hindsight, and this is the thing you can never know with hindsight, is how the draft's going to play out. We could have potentially got Dallas Goedert in the 6th round, for example, as our tight end. That was where we took George Pickens. Kyle Pitts, Shawn did go one pick ahead, as we mentioned at the time. But we, looking through this draft and how it went, I'm probably looking at, in hindsight, the best option in that 5th, 6th round is possibly to go with Drake London over TJ Hawkinson, and then to go with Dallas Goedert over George Pickens? Or would you rather have it as it currently is and pass up on both of those tight ends, go with Drake London or Jackson Smith and Jigba with George Pickens, and then see how wide receiver went later on in the draft?
Yeah, I think that the way that we selected was the right pick at the time.
Yeah.
And then when you look at what the options were, a Christian Kirk, a Michael Pittman, a Drake London, I don't think that those guys really move the needle for us. I don't think it's a situation where we prefer to have them and then Dallas Goedert, because George Pickens just sort of straight up, I think, would be fine against those players. The question would be to take the tight end out completely. But again, I don't know those other guys move the needle. We talked about JSN. He's the player I would like there if we do go receiver. I think he's going to have a huge year, so we could look at that. Then the next spot that is interesting is we talked about that James Cook, Javonte Williams turn, especially since we got Samaje Perine at what I would consider a great price at the 11.02. Maybe at the Williams pick, then you take Rashad Bateman. But that's the reason why you have to be so aware of the way wide receivers come off the board in these drafts, because Bateman now is in this situation where they've drafted over him with Zay Flowers. They've added Odell Beckham. Obviously, Mark Andrews is still going to be the focal point. There are questions about whether, if you remove some of those Lamar Jackson runs that are so dynamic and keep this offense really on schedule, then is he capable of passing to the level necessary to get all of these guys going? And then with Bateman, can he stay healthy? Is he the talent that we all thought he was? I like the pick, but there are reasons why he's there. But if Javonte Williams gets healthy, you're looking at him just with a much, much higher ceiling, both in terms of giving you that RB1 upside in the fantasy playoffs and being a better flex play. So from both of those perspectives, again, I think that we made the right call. Brian Robinson, a good value. Samaje Perine, a fantastic value. And then we get into the range where we have to take some quarterbacks. We do that. It's really mostly a matter then of, if we had gone with Drake London, who's still a very solid pick, even with their decision to keep Arthur Smith, to go with Desmond Ridder. When you add Bijan instead of doing other things to kind of round out that team, again, you're talking about things that hurt both his floor on a weekly basis and hurt his ceiling on a yearly basis. If you make that pick, then you can go with Desmond Ridder late, and you don't necessarily feel pressed into drafting 2 quarterbacks right here. And so your second one.
In this particular situation, Desmond Ridder went at 198. We did Trey McBride at 194. Maybe in that situation, we've passed on either Pickett or Love, but we leave the third tight end. We take our second quarterback there. Probably fits better.
Right. But then you look at it again, you're like, okay, so if you don't take Jordan Love, the quarterbacks who kind of go in the interim, or the wide receivers, who go in the interim are DJ Chark, Michael Gallup, Nico Collins, Josh Downs, Rashid Shaheed. I mean, none of those are guys you really want on your roster. It's not to say that they couldn't be good football players this year or score some points. Collins could be the wide receiver 1 in Houston for all the good that it may do him. So I think as you go back through this draft, it really pushes you in the direction of thinking that you made the right call. I like that. If you're going to do something a little bit different, the quarterbacks here, for anyone listening and not seeing the YouTube version, Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes went at the 1-2 turn to the same drafter. That puts the entire rest of the league under some pressure there because one player has taken those 2 guys both off the board. Jalen Hurts then in the mid-second. In order to get one of the difference-making quarterbacks, we would have had to do it instead of the Breece Hall pick at the 302 because Lamar Jackson and Justin Fields go immediately after that pick. As you work through this then, Colm, the rest of the guys, again, going so early here that I like targeting the QBs in the window. One of the things that we were really looking at was a Tua pick, even without either of the 2 receivers, but he also goes 2 picks ahead of us in round 8. Ideally, you have some of these guys slide to you. We had a number of our targets taken a pick or 2 before we selected. That happens in drafts. I like the way we pivoted.
Yeah, and I think when we look through it, for example, at the top of the draft, we obviously start off with the 102. We get Chase, but we do get the fortune of some of the players that we were thinking about taking at certain spots with the turn. We ended up getting both of the guys. For example, the Pickens and Mike Evans selection, we get both of those. There was a few times we got both of the players that we wanted. So we can't be just, the players were taking 2 picks ahead of us at one point, but we were getting all this value and players falling our way at the start. But I do think that on a different day, things may have fallen slightly different and we would be slightly more enthusiastic, I guess, about the overall. But the thing that you mentioned there, Shawn, is when you look back through the overall draft board, sometimes you're wondering, the team could be better in this way or that way. But then when you look through how the draft board fell, there's not a lot of things that you would change when you sit down and look directly at that. And that's what makes drafting so much fun. Each draft board gives you those little variations or differences. So overall, in hindsight and reflection, I'm pretty happy with this board. Is it the perfect team that I would have dreamed of having? Not exactly, but is it a team that I still like a lot? It is very much so. The one that you mentioned about things you could change, one of the picks that could have possibly been different based on how things may have played out at the quarterback position would have been if we weren't pushed to take 2 quarterbacks when we did. I think that's where I look at the second tight end at that point. And Greg Dulcich did slide a little bit in this, so there was a great value on him in the mid-14th round, and Sam Laporta did go then 1 pick after that. There was quite a few tight ends went in rounds 13 and 14. And I think if Jordan Love isn't there and you take Schultz, Greg Dulcich, or Laporta potentially at the 1-4-6 pick, that would have allowed us to potentially wait then on the Desmond Ridder pick instead of Trey McBride. And we then would have freed up that Michael Mayer pick potentially to go in a different direction. But again, when we look at the players that go after Mayer in this scenario, it's Donovan Peoples-Jones, Mac Jones, who would have been kind of passing by at that point, Curtis Samuel, MBS, number of other players then after that aren't really, but you're into that tier that you talked about in round 16 that was Rondell Moore, then Marvin Mims, John Menchie, Taquan Thornton, Jaden Reed, and I think you probably pick up one of those guys over where we took Michael Mayer. But that is picking out the perfect board based on everything falling your way, and that is not the way it's going to happen. So if we pass on one of those players, there's a good chance they all go in a different order. So in hindsight, Shawn, pretty happy overall. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. What's your grading out of 10 for the roster here?
Colm, I'm an enthusiast, and
It's an 11 out of 10.
well, I'm maybe more of a realist than understanding how, the most you can get out of 10 is 10. So I probably would stick with that. You just can't go into these drafts and make big mistakes. And so unless you do, if you end up with the players that you like at good prices, one of the elements too with someone like a Trey McBride is that his valuation seems so far off that if you were going to draft him sort of relative to that, you would end up with an exposure level that doesn't really work. So it's one of the reasons why we're not going to be taking Mayer in every draft. We're not going to be taking McBride in every draft simply because you don't want to be to that level, but they do appear to have broken ADPs. I think that same thing is true of Pickett and Love. Maybe they don't excite you in the same way that some other QBs do, but if we had quarterbacks who massively surprise, as opposed to chasing a Geno Smith, chasing a Jared Goff, drafting a Derek Carr at the level that he's going at, making the play with potential breakout quarterbacks is the way that you're going to be able to navigate some of this tricky QB pricing. It's not a guarantee. There are going to be some bets that you make that don't work out, that kill some of those teams, but it's something to at least factor into your decision making and make sure you're feathering them in at times, because the upside relative to the price on those guys is very, very good. And so I think for that part of it, I am willing to go ahead and give us, the full score. We won't say the perfect score, but just the full score on that column. Really enjoyed this draft. Looking forward to some more.
Yeah, awesome stuff. And that's the perfect note again to end it on. We're full of enthusiasm, and don't be afraid to draft as much Trey McBride as you can physically do. I'll always be on board with that. But that is going to wrap us up for today's bonus edition. As I mentioned, it is a draft edition. We did a BBM4 draft over at Underdog Fantasy. If you are signing up over at Underdog Fantasy, you can use the code RotoViz to get yourself a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100. If you are interested as well, you can sign up over at rotoviz.com, get yourself a 1-year NFL pass, which gets you access to all of the content and tools up on rotoviz.com. That code is RVRadio2023. Use that at checkout, save yourself 10%. We will be back on Monday with another edition. As always, make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz podcast feed. You get these episodes once they go live. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host, as always, is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.